Welcome back to Cryptid Mysterious. Today we have two stories, both of which are very interesting, each in their own way. You don't want to miss today's episode. Let's jump right in to the first story. Well, actually, before we do that, please smash that subscribe button for me. And we know that like button is a wild one. We need to put him in his place and smack him around a little bit. If you would do that real fast for me, I'd appreciate that. Let's get into the first of two stories today. This one comes to us from a retired professor named Richard Hayes. He begins, "In my earlier years, I was an observer of all things. I would regularly take long hikes, either alone or in the company of my wife after we'd met. On this particular day, which was June 23rd of 1956, my wife and I had gone into the Moyer Woods National Monument, which is a protected cathedral-like grove of virgin redwoods located in a valley north of San Francisco. So you can understand, the area of which I speak was entirely different than it is now. There was not a fraction of the people that one can see in the region today. As a little science lesson, which I think you can appreciate, many people often confuse the coastal redwoods with the giant sequoia of the Sierra. Both belong to the genus Sequoia, I'm not sure how to say that word, but are separate species of that genus. Sorry. Drop in the comments if I'm not pronouncing it right. The species that grows in the Moyer Woods is Sequoia sempervirens, which is more commonly called the Redwood. The species which now grows in the Sierra Nevada at altitudes between 4,000 and 8,000 feet is Sequoia gigantine, more commonly known as the giant sequoia. Redwoods can live about 2,000 years, while giant sequoias can exceed 3,000 years or more. Many of these trees were alive when Christ was put on the cross. To bring this into perspective, my wife and I had begun our hike from the parking lot on the main trail. At the time, it was the park's policy that nobody was to leave the trail. We began the hike on what was known as the Nature Trail, which brought us into the area of redwoods known as Bohemian Grove. When we exited the grove, we'd crossed Redwood Creek and proceeded up the main trail towards what was known as Cathedral Grove, a distance which was perhaps half a mile or so. Now, to the unlearned, one might think that you would be walking through a woods comprised of telephone poles, with visibility being grand in every direction. But such is not the case. The forest is predominantly quite shady, and there are actually many varieties of trees and bushes competing for the sunlight at the base of the forest. That, in conjunction with the quantity and width of the redwoods, made for a more tunnel-like effect on the trail in most locations. You could not see very far ahead to your right or left. The two of us were alone and well along in the trail when we stopped to look at the California variety of fetid Aderdostung, Astertungu. Come on, help me out. Drop in the comments. How do you say that word? Adderstung? That's probably it. Growing by the base of one of the redwoods. This is a rather unique plant, and it caught our eye. As the two of us were bent over examining this plant species, the view ahead of us on the trail looked somewhat like a keyhole formed by the trees. We were touching the plant and talking about its beauty when out of the corner of my eyes, I saw something dart across the trail beyond this keyhole that I just described to you. Whatever it was had crossed the trail on 2 legs, maybe 150 to 200 feet ahead of us. I told my wife, I thought I'd just seen a man on the path ahead of us, but that I was uncertain of. My wife replied, well, let's go have a look. As we were walking ahead, we heard a distinct whoop whoop. The noise came from within the forest to our left. From our perspective, you couldn't see a thing except branches, bushes, and tree trunks. There wasn't a soul in sight. My wife and I had both said that no one was supposed to go off the trail into the woods. So who exactly had done this, we don't know. Upon reaching the spot where I saw the man cross the trail, there was somewhat of an opening in the trees, looking back into the forest for quite some distance. As we stood there, peering through this picture frame-like view, going back deep into the trees, a large, hairy, gorilla-like creature leaned out from behind a redwood and quickly moved back behind it. My wife said to me, "My word, Richard, what on earth was that? Did you see it?" I had seen exactly what she had. It was what appeared to be an 8-foot or 9-foot tall gorilla. Keeping in mind that at the time, there were no discussions about Bigfoot or Sasquatch in this area. We had never heard of such a thing. Neither had we read any material whatsoever in any scientific publications about them. We had simply observed something that we were trying to label and term gorilla. The tree it was hiding behind had enormous girth, and we could see nothing of it. My wife said that she was frightened and wanted to go back to the car. As I was trying to comfort her and get her to stay for just a few more minutes, this gorilla thing walked out from behind the tree and back into the forest out of our sight. The two of us, to be quite frank, were completely baffled by what we had just seen. As the creature walked away, its back was turned to us, and it had briefly turned its upper body to give us a glance. At that moment, its skin looked gray on the face, and it had a very broad jawline. The face was completely devoid of hair, as far as I can remember, and the overall dimensions of the creature's body were staggering. Its body was so wide, it had been hiding behind anything less than a redwood, we would have seen it for sure. Its thighs and legs were so thick that as soon as I realized, as I saw it, that it must have been further than I thought when I first saw it, out of the corner of my eye. The fur appeared to be a mix of dark brown and red. This coloration was only visible for a brief moment as I walked through the solitary ray of sunlight gleaming down through the canopy. When it turned its head to look at us, it didn't really turn its head, but rather its entire upper body. I knew why after it turned back away from us. The head was actually tucked forward into the shoulders. Because as it walked away, the enormous muscles of its upper back concealed most of the head. It apparently couldn't just turn its head around without the whole body following. The shoulder width must have been every bit of 5 to 6 feet. It wasn't until that film had made headlines years later we now knew what we had seen and what he had filmed. This creature was very similar to the one in that film, only more lean and muscular. Well, that was our experience. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope I did a pretty good job giving you all the details that I remember. Well, thanks, Richard. Appreciate the story. Let's move on to our second encounter of the episode. This one comes to us from Todd, a resident of Tacoma, Washington. Here's what he has to say. I was working the timber northeast of Kluchman Rock on the western edge of the Queets River. I had hiked in about 4 miles from the Queets Ranger Station and was set up against a tall pine near the edge of what appeared to be a well-used game trail. Being unfamiliar with the location, after about 2 hours of seeing nothing, I decided to backtrack to an area I had passed through on my hike that looked pretty good, and once again positioned myself with my back against a large fir. I don't think that I was sitting there for more than 10 minutes when I shifted my body to get more comfortable, and then something jabbed me right in the butt. I stood up and looked down at the ground, moving some of the mulch and crap out of the way in order to see what I sat on, and immediately started to uncover what appeared to me to be human bones. In other words, this was a human skeleton, but not the whole skeleton. This was like a human hand or foot or something. I was convinced they were human and not animal, having sat through many hours of skeletal anatomy classes, but what they were doing here by this tree was anyone's guess. I set my gun against the tree, grabbing a branch. I started to clear away more of the debris on the ground surrounding the base of this large fir, and as I did, I uncovered more bones, which I was now certain were the ulnar radius and humerus bones from a human arm. This now told me that the bones I had first found were in fact the metacarpal and phalanges from the same arm. I was alone and distinctly remember a raw chill going through my entire body as I realized what I was uncovering. Having been there, I can speak in all honesty that there is something really eerie about standing in the spot where an unburied human had met their apparent demise. And yet here I found myself, alone, deep in the woods. I'd actually cleared a decent-sized little area with the branch to uncover what I'd found as far as bones were concerned. And I could not see nor find any more. So there I stood, trying to make sense out of having found partial human remains next to the tree. It was then that I started thinking, as anyone else would have, just how is it that a human arm and nothing else found its way into the woods, detached from its owner? I remember standing there, rubbing my forehead with my fingers as I was trying to make some sense of it all, when something told me, look up, and I did. The initial set of substantial boughs on this tree actually began protruding from the trunk some 30 feet from the ground. As I looked up, my eyes were immediately drawn to some colored fabric draped across one of the boughs. I could now see enough to realize that I was looking at the remains of a clothed human being laying across this large bough. It was directly above where I had found the bones of the hand and arm. I immediately took note of the fact that there was no tree stand or climbing apparatus attached to the trunk, nor were there smaller limbs that a man or anything else could have supported themselves on to climb this tree to that height. This person had either shimmied up the tree and died, or something else had done the same, carrying it up the tree. There was no backpack or weapon of any sort visible on the ground surrounding the area. No sooner had I come to grips with what was already turning out to be a gore fest that my eyes caught a glimpse of some other colored fabric in a different part of the tree that was also very high off the ground. I walked around the base of the tree to better position myself in order to see whatever it was more clearly. I realized that not only was I seeing the remains of yet another human being, but there was also what appeared to be the carcass of a deer or elk, some 10 feet away from it, also laying across some boughs. It was at that precise moment in time that I was suddenly keenly aware, deep inside my innermost being, that I was now being watched. There's no other way of explaining it to you. I felt as though whoever or whatever had done this terrible deed was now aware that I knew it too. And it, or they, were not happy about it. I had a long hike out, and although I hadn't planned to leave at this part of the day before I'd come upon all this grisly stuff. I knew that I had to leave, and leave now. That's the way I felt at that moment in time. I suddenly felt as though I was now in imminent danger by remaining here and quite possibly on my way out as well. As I began to make my way out, I must inform you that there were many areas of this forest where something could easily jump out on you if it wanted to, and there would be little if any time for you to react. That's just the nature of hunting. We are stalking something in the surroundings in which we ourselves could easily become the hunted if the tables were turned. Today, I was starting to feel as though they had been. It must have been a mile or so into my outbound hike when I came into what I'll call a shallow valley between two hills. I was retracing the way I had come in earlier in the day. The central path between these two hills was damp and soggy to walk on. I could see my boot tracks from earlier in the day when unexpectedly there before my eyes, mixed in with my own tracks, were the giant imprints of a human-type foot that were made in the same direction as mine were coming in. There were about 8 of them, and many others alongside of the softer muddied area that I could see. Now, I knew that either a Bigfoot had followed me in or had traversed the same route that I had sometime after me. In either case, it could easily see my tracks and where I was heading. These tracks, although I didn't stop to measure them, were all of 20 to 25 inches long. And in the softer area, they were all of 6 inches into the ground, where my own were maybe an inch. At that moment, the thought had entered my mind that I was going to die in the woods that day, and nobody would ever find me. I was hunting with my lever-action Winchester, and I chambered around. I had stepped up my pace while being as cautious as I possibly could, taking into consideration the way I felt at the time. When I found myself passing through a really dense grouping of trees, I was only about 30 yards, if that, into this grouping when I heard a loud snap that was followed by a deep growl to my right. What happened next was the result of a knee-jerk reaction, based entirely on a building fear within me. I turned with my Winchester and emptied it in a fan pattern, quickly ratcheting off every round. I distinctly remember salvo number 4 because no sooner had I squeezed it off than a scream of demonic proportions erupted from the trees. I thought I had shot the devil himself, and the screaming didn't stop. I quickly loaded the gun and repeated the same spray pattern I had just done, firing off 6 more rounds, and started to run faster than I'd ever run in my life. I was running and shoving more rounds into the breech as best I could. The last thing I wanted to do was turn an ankle or worse. I could hear this thing wailing behind me, having evidently been shot by round number 4. I covered the last 4 miles out to the ranger station faster than I would have believed I could have ever run in my life. When I reached the station, the ranger asked me what I was firing at, to which I lied and said, no. I had heard the shots also. It wasn't me. I don't know why, but I didn't want to get into the whole Bigfoot thing and have to explain to him what had happened. I did, however, tell him about what I'd found in the tree, and he was all ears. Well, the next day, I led a group of 10 lawmen on foot back to the location, and everyone was shocked as I was when I found the bodies. I told the men that I really didn't want to be there anymore, and 2 of them brought me back out. There was some of the usual questioning, as you can imagine, but I think it was obvious to everyone that I didn't kill these people or put them up in the tree either. I'm sure that I shot a Bigfoot that day, but I have no tangible proof other than what I've already told you up to this point in time. Who these people were, I have no idea. And neither did I follow up at all with the law enforcement to ask any further questions regarding this whole grisly matter. But I will end this saying as much. No cougar or any other animal is capable of scaling a bare tree trunk to such heights, carrying a human body out onto a limb. On top of that, coming back down the tree several times for another human and another animal. This had to have been performed by a Bigfoot, nothing less. Well, guys, I appreciate you hanging out. Let me know what you think about these two stories in the comments section. To be honest with you, I'd love to have an experience or an encounter with one of these Bigfoot things, but it'd be nice if it was from a little better of a distance, like across a mountain valley or something where they couldn't see me. This last story here sounds like a story I don't want to end up having myself. I think that would just be a little too much. But I don't think this guy was exactly looking for it, if you know what I mean. I do appreciate y'all hanging out with me. If you've had an encounter with a Bigfoot, or anything mysterious for that matter, drop an email to cryptidmysterious@gmail.com, and I'll see you in the next one.